Okay. Judith, you are from New York. You have your own personal history. We will talk about that. When have you been to Frankfurt, to the fair for the first time?
Does this work? Yes. Hello, everyone. It's a real honor to be here. It's the first time I ever spoke in Frankfurt. Like this? Can you hear me? So the first time I came to Frankfurt, I don't remember exactly, but it must have been 2004, something like that, maybe a little earlier. And I came with a few chapters of a very, very good book. And I was giving it to people along, so it was, and I was able to make a big success of this book, which was called Harry Down Sunshine by Michael Greenberg. And this is how I met Günter, who at the time was the publisher of Hofmann and Campe. And he read the 20 pages, it was good. And I did that with a few others. And he's people in the publishing world have remained my closest friends ever since. And this is how I started my life in Frankfurt. I come every year. I love it.
Better.
I never did this, so is that okay now? So that's the answer. My company is called Other Press, and it's a small independent house situated in New York. And my background is in, strangely, law, sociology, and Lacanian psychoanalysis. I'm still practicing a little bit psychoanalysis. And I felt that I think my definition of my press is that I try to be counterintuitive. Probably I learned this from philosophy, sociology, psychoanalysis, that what is most important is to try to find a different truth, try to come to a place that you don't expect. Try to, be transformed by what you read. And when you read, you learn, and you enjoy at the same time. So in a way, to be a publisher is really something as close to the deepest pleasure as possible, which is that you read something and you feel transformed by it. And I would say that's the definition of the press. It's always had a social and political side. I would say progressive, leftist, whatever you want to call it. It's a word that doesn't mean anything anymore. But it's something that attempt to change the way we think, attempt to deconstruct ideology mainly, and go to another truth, the obvious truth that people claim to have.
Judith, you, as we all, you were not born as a publisher. Perhaps a few sentences for those friends who definitely not know what your history, what your story is.
Okay, I want to be very short because it's more important to talk about authors than talk about me. So basically my background is in law. I studied law in Brussels and in America at Columbia. I then got a PhD in sociology at the University of Brandeis, where I studied subjectivity and sociology through Lacan. I became a practicing Lacanian psychoanalysis after that. I was asked to teach a seminar on Lacan at Harvard during the years where Zizek was very big. He came to teach in my class. And I was trying to explain to professor of literature and cultural studies and comparative literature that Lacan was helping people to overcome pain and was not simply a literary critic, because at the time Lacan was very, very big, in universities, much more than in the therapeutic world where he was considered a devil. So I was already on the side of the devil then, and that's when I realized that I needed to publish those books that explain that Lacan can help people overcome their pain. And I created a small publishing house on psychoanalysis. And then I got a little tired of that. And again, this is connected to the German language. I was lucky enough through Eva Koralnik, who was a very important age at the time. I encountered Peter Stamm. I read Peter Stamm in French overnight. And Peter Stamm was my first entrance into literature. I published all of Peter Stamm. So that's more or less where and then I continue with a lot of work in different languages, from German, French, because I speak French first. So French publishers translate much more than American or English publishers. So I was able to read in French a lot of foreign literature, gave me a chance to pick some really interesting books. And then at a certain time, I became extremely interested in the situation in Israel. So we'll talk about that later. But that gives you a general view of what my publishing is.
Very interesting. And now I think we should come to the point. Most of the people here, most of us know that lots of visual artists, writers, and publishers have released statements of solidarity with Palestinian author Adania Shibli, who was until last week set to receive an award here at the Frankfurt Book Fair. A few days ago, 5 or 6 days ago, the organizers of the prize, which is sponsored, I think, partly of the German government and the Frankfurt Book Fair, released a statement saying that they were seeking alternatives to hosting the ceremony at the event. What is it under these circumstances? Is it appropriate? Is it coward? What does it mean? Judith was asked this question, and she said, may I read your answer to this question? Well, that's good, without being asked. She said the fact that Germany is canceling an event featuring an important Palestinian book is a serious mistake. Germany atoned for the Holocaust in a very visible and respectable way, and supporting Israel's announcement that it would commit a new genocide is not an ethical stance. This is a tough statement.
You think so?
Yes, I think so. Would you like to explain that to us?
Yes, I can explain. I try to explain. Everything always comes. I mean, it's because I'm a psychoanalyst, so I always, go back to some foundational things. I grew up in a Jewish family. My family, my grandmother died in the camps. My father was in a war camp. He was able to escape. My mother's family was a bit more clever. They escaped Czechoslovakia earlier, but they were immigrants. They ended up in Canada. My husband's family were from Berlin. My husband still, as a Jew, feels he's a Berliner first, doesn't matter what. And they also were able to escape in 1935. They went to England, and then they moved to the States in 1942 when the war started in Europe, when England was on the threat. So I grew up very much aware of my background. I also went to Brandeis, which is some kind of a very leftist Jewish university. I was completely shaped by Weber and the Frankfurt School. So I took enormous pride in the negative dialectic that was invented by Jews. So I always had a little bit of a complex of superiority that, thanks to my background, I could question things all the time. And I said, that's the only, a Jew always answer a question by another question. That's really what was my identity, and I love that. I started my life, because everybody did, to be a Zionist. I celebrated 97. And it's quite funny because my boyfriend at the time was much more leftist, left me because I went to a demonstration inside of 67. Never forget that. Then I came to the States. I did I went to Israel a few times. I never liked it very much. I thought it was quite rough. But being Zionist is the way you grow up as a Jew. Then when I moved to the States and I started my company, I was sitting in the kitchen with my husband having breakfast, and we heard on the radio that there were Israeli officers who refused to fight in the second Intifada. And he said, we're sitting here having breakfast, and those guys are resisting and going to prison. You have to do something. It's kind of really easy for him, right? He's a doctor. So I was able to put together a book called Breaking Ranks, which was a collection of interviews of those soldiers that were in prison for refusing to fight in the Intifada. So that gave me the idea that there were some people in Israel who understood that there was something wrong. Then I proceeded with other books that were a little bit more, important in scale, such as Breaking Ranks by Charles Enderlin, which was Shattered Dreams. Shattered Dreams by Charles Enderlin, which is about the story of the Oslo Accord and the disaster that followed. He's also a journalist, a Jewish journalist who lived in Israel. And Sylvain Sipel, who also lived in Israel, went to the army there, was a major journalist of the Monde afterwards. And he wrote two books, one called Walled, Israeli Society at an Impasse, and another one that was a big success in America, and then another one that people got really nervous about, which was called Israel Against the Jews, the State of Israel Against the Jews. So that's basically, the foundation that led me to see that there was something very problematic about the history of how Israel came about. And as an analyst, I would say it's a constant return of the repressed. A fundamental mistake was made at the beginning, and the Nakba was not something Jews should have somehow supported. And that's why also it came to mind that the title of this talk is a transmission of trauma, because what is the point of trauma is to understand what is trauma and understand that trauma, when it's fully understood, can be incredibly transformative and can change the world if you understand what caused the trauma and you no longer want to repeat it. So this is more or less the background of how I came to publish books by Jews that were criticizing Israel. And I felt, of course, very at home with that perspective. Then I'll move on to the Palestinian side in a minute. Maybe you have some questions.
Well, other press publishes Jewish authors, Palestinian authors, Turkish authors, Lebanese authors. Well, you are, for the reasons you explained to us, not focused on this part of the world, but you are interested in all these things. I think there might be one very interesting book that will be published by other press early next year by a, let's say, very special Palestinian author.
We'll talk about that. But before I talk about that, which is basically the only thing I want to talk about, so I want to be a little careful. It is true that I've learned a lot by publishing controversial books from around the world, especially North African and African books. The most interesting book I just published was the Goncourt Prize, The Most Secret Memory of Men, which was based on Bound to Violence by Django Woolagem, who was completely decried by the world because he was accused of plagiarism. But something more important was there in that book, in my view, which is that he used Africa as a microsome, as a social total fact, as most would say, about can Africa be a symbol or a metaphor of the world, and can it be looked as something that is, bound to violence? And everybody was shocked because he dared to criticize his land, which was perceived by some, as a place that was in contrast with the horror of the Western world. So I'm very aware of these counterintuitive aspects, of literature, that literature makes you think outside the box a lot. So what happened was that after things were getting worse and worse, and I was becoming more and more interested in what was happening in Palestine, I was lucky enough through my friend Pierre Astier, to whom I said, how come you don't sell, Pierre Astier is a very, very renowned agent, and I asked him, how come you don't sell me any Palestinian work? He says, you're right, this is terrible. So guess what? The next day, I get a call that Olivia had found a book for me. And so I received in Arabic a book by Nasser Abu Sur, who was published in Lebanon, and it is a memoir of his life in prison without parole He's in Israel. I'll tell you the story in a minute. And thanks to Olivia, I got that book. I happen to have a very good friend in Cambridge where I live who is Palestinian, whose father is an avid reader, because I never buy a book I can't read. But in this case, he's in one day, he read the whole book and told me it was a masterpiece, so I bought it. And I was lucky enough after that to find a Harvard professor who does translation from the Arabic. And together we kind of edited the book a little bit. And I'm extremely proud that I have something here, which is the Tale of the Wall by Nasser Al-Sur, which is a memoir that recounts his life, but much more than his life. It is really, I would say, a true metaphysical and introspective voyage inside the mind of what it means to be a Palestinian, especially in a refugee camp after the Nakba. So the book recounts, first of all, you have to understand that he was put in prison for life for being involved in ways that were never fully proven in the killing of a Shin Bet officer after the Shin Bet officer was notorious for trying to convince or try to blackmail young people in the refugee camp to become informant. And one of the cousins, because Nasser was very young at the time, and one of the cousins of Nasser decided that he didn't want to do this, and he really wanted to stop this process. So they tried to corner the officer. Oh my God! And they tried to corner the officer, and then eventually this officer was killed, and he was treated like a murderer that cannot possibly ever come out of prison. Even though he was put twice on the Oslo Accord list to be released, he wasn't released. And he got 3 degrees in prison, 3 university degrees, and he tells the story of his life. And the book is separated in 3 parts. The first part is explaining in a few pages how it's the story of a wall, because in prison he was talking to the wall because the wall was his only friend, because he was in solitary confinement. And also he had to confess under torture. That's why he doesn't understand exactly what he did, because the torture erased the logic of his memory. So he explained how he talks to the wall, and that the wall saved his life because he was the only sane other he had. And that's why he calls it that way, because it's the wall that he talks to that tells him back the story. The first part of the book is the life in the refugee camp, what it means when you're a young man or child to live in a world where past, present, and future are completely erased. You don't know how time operates because there is no hope. Everything is in a circle. And he even has the image in the book where he says, in a refugee camp, children carry their grandparents on their shoulder. And so he really gives the life of a refugee camp in beautiful ways. It's always very introspective, because for the first time in my life, I encountered the stream of consciousness of someone living that life. Because before that, I was politically on the right side, so to speak, but I was doing it more from an ethical perspective than from a personal perspective. So I entered into the world there. And then the second part is politics. He explained the disaster of the Oslo Accord. He explains also the way Israeli treats prisoners, the torture, the abuse, mental and physical, which is unbelievable considering, who Jews are. And then the last part is a remarkable, very moving love affair between Nasser and his lawyer. It's a very beautifully, very poetic section, and which of course ended because after the Oslo Accord he wasn't released, so he wanted to end it because it was too painful to keep it going. So this is an amazing book. It completely killed my other list, and I have some amazing other books, and all I did for the last 3 days is talk about this book, hoping for people to see it. And the only one thing I want to say again is that what we need to do today, and this is what I always try to show, is that if one wants to understand, one needs absolutely to put good and evil on the side. You cannot think of good and evil if you want to think intelligently and counterintuitively. Who is the culprit is not the point. The transmission of trauma is there. The transmission of trauma that I think is being much more, I would say, manipulated. You know, in a way, the Israeli are manipulating their past, while the Palestinians have become the Jews of today. They really are enduring a trauma, and they don't have the tools to fight the trauma in a way that could be more helpful, even though they try. A lot of them on the ground try. The government, of course, are not as good as them. But I've met a lot of Palestinians, and they remind me of the Frankfurt School. I mean, this is the absolute, irony of it all. So,
Judith, I think we must come to an end. Minutes.
That's terrible.
Fortunately, you and I, we are not journalists. Fortunately, we are not politicians. Any attempt, that's what we learned in the last days, any attempt at an explanation could be seen as a distraction from the main point, the incomprehensible and incomparable committed by terrorists in Israel. But, this word is very important, I think, in the last days, but we are dealing with books, with authors, with stories, with history. So the old question, what can literature do?
I think literature can do, I wish I had the time to read a passage of Walter Benjamin, who says that in a moment of danger, you have a memory that comes to you, and the memory is not going to be exact. So to examine that memory and trace the historical roots of that memory is what can bring change, what can bring a different reading. And this is exactly what we have to think. Imagine this terrible attack of Hamas. What memory does it bring on both sides? And why did it happen? And what is the history behind it? So at first you would say, it's horrible. It's a new form of genocide. And I said, really? Is it really what it is? Is there another way to go deeper into trying to understand the root of this very, undiplomatic and very unnecessary way of expressing itself? There's a logic to that. What is the logic? What brought people who have been oppressed for years? I can't help to think of Gaza and the Warsaw Ghetto as comparable in some ways, in strange ways. I'm not comparing Hamas, I'm comparing Gaza. So there's a lot there that if you think what literature does, it makes you take a distance. You surrender to something that you don't know. And if literature and nonfiction of quality written by really smart people who are passionate about history. This is why one of my mentors is Patrick Boucheron, because he's the one who taught me, who used Benjamin in history in ways that tells you, well, think again. What is it really that is happening and why? And not go with the news and the media and the easy answer. I think the defense mechanism we all have is to try to find an answer that makes you look good in the moment. That's all we do. How do we position ourselves to look good in the moment? And basically, this is exactly what literature does. It totally deconstructs that feeling and say, wait a minute, there are layers and layers here. And one has to understand that, when I talk about transmission of trauma, I'm not trying to psychologize politics, because that's a huge mistake. But we can also understand, when power is the only goal of certain people, and that how other people endure, and how trauma is being exploited for the purpose of power. And that is something that I think is exactly what is happening right now. How to use past trauma, exploit past trauma, instead of trying to transform past trauma into something new, creative, and different, and positive.
And the books will help us understand the world.
Hopefully.
Hopefully. So, what I want to say last is that this book fair is always a chance of coming together, making business, sure, but talking about books, talking about authors, exchange opinions, find other points of view. And I think in these days, they are not very easy. Books and publishers like Judith I think are very, very important to understand the world and to get new ideas. And I hope that we all come together every year in Frankfurt, because most of us see that this book fair, this place where people from all over the world come together, is a very, very important thing. So thank you, Judith, and thank you all.
I'm very honored, and thank you, Olivia. And Ricky.